Alec, I want to just start with you because, I've read some of what you've been writing about when it comes to or speaking about when it comes to Twiplomacy. Two of the main challenges that seem to emerge are the speed with which news breaks, on social media in particular, and more importantly, another challenge being the ability to discern and to control messaging. A lot of people point to what happened in the attacks in Libya and in Egypt. We saw within minutes after the attacks, the US Embassy started to tweet out emergency numbers for US citizens, so there's a positive outlet there. But then very quickly they got into a spat with the Muslim Brotherhood accounts. They even tweeted out a message that of course became a political relevance, let's say, saying the continuing efforts by misguided individuals to hurt the religious feelings of Muslims, so on and so forth. In your mind, what are the biggest challenges, and is that an example of how perhaps e-diplomacy might be counterproductive to a government's foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think there's an inherent tension between the speed of these networks and the pace of diplomacy and the process of policy formation and other such things. So I actually think it's important that we at the State Department not view ourselves as having to be first or having to sort of quickly respond to things in the manner in which others can. And in fact, I actually don't think we always have to keep up. I think that we're far better off sometimes being more deliberate and more precise in some of our communications and other such things. Having said that, the 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. And not every message, not every comma and semicolon can come from a process born out of Washington with 20 clearances that is then passed through the system to be articulated locally. I think that there is some, if you're going to be effective in this domain, you have to give up a measure of control. And you do have to let your well-trained diplomats at post be able to communicate and engage with people locally. Now, the inherent tension here is that people back in Washington sometimes can read it, and the way in which someone might read something in Cairo, Ohio, is the same words will be read and interpreted differently in Cairo, Egypt. And so this is just makes our job more difficult.
Obviously, you can't manage a tweet, each tweet, and you shouldn't. But what is then the advantage of, for example, when the U.S. Embassy was tweeting, thanking those who expressed, solidarity or sympathy with the attack, so on and so forth. It seems almost that it's an individual speaking rather than the U.S. government. Can you just speak more about what the advantage is there?
Sure. So, people tend to follow individuals as opposed to institutions in social media. And this, again, is one of those tensions for the State Department because we're used to leading with an institutional as opposed to individual face. And if there is an official account, there are human beings behind it. And so this is one of those paradoxes within social media, and it's something that we're grappling with that our predecessors did not have to. In terms of the advantages, it allows people to feel like they're having a real discussion with real Americans as opposed to just passively listening to what is being said from behind the podium. So it's been interesting to me. So sometimes I feel like it's not a particularly personal process to be communicating with hundreds of thousands of people over social media, but the response that I personally get from people is that they do appreciate that connection. They do appreciate the sense that they can actually have an open dialogue with us. It has its limits, but it's better for our purposes than just the traditional broadcast approach to communicating with foreign publics.
Well, I'm glad. But perhaps David or Ambassador, if you'd like to answer this question on engagement. We know Barack Obama, the U.S. president, is perhaps the most popular leader on Twitter. But the truth is only 1% of his tweets are replies. It seems, David, that many leaders, although some more than others, engage with citizens, engage even with other world leaders. The truth is that a lot of these leaders rely on this just to amplify their messaging. So, in that sense, is e-diplomacy really effective, or does it actually exist if you're just amplifying your own message?
if you could use e-diplomacy to mobilize pressure to achieve goals that you couldn't otherwise achieve. Because I've just read the latest volume of the biography of Lyndon Johnson. I'm trying to imagine Lyndon Johnson with a Twitter account. And,
Disaster.
In one sense, it's ridiculous, but he would understand the power of this medium is to squeeze somebody. You know, is to he's got to count votes, and he's going to use this to get the votes so he gets something passed. Now, that's something you could argue that this president or his successor is going to need. We have a system of governance that isn't very good now in solving problems. It doesn't solve immigration problems, doesn't solve fiscal problems. We all know about how divided politics is. Social media will be most interesting to the extent they're used to pressure, drive solutions, drive the herd toward the paddock. I know that's the opposite of what you're supposed to say, but I think that's what we actually need. We need to get toward solutions, not toward discussion.
And maybe I can ask you, Deborah, do you think that propaganda is perhaps as popular as diplomacy on social media?
Oh, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think what you just point to is something that's really critical, is that social media doesn't have a mechanism for checking accuracy. Not everybody signs up to the same values of what's true and what's not true. And so when there's an interchange in the social media sphere between party X and party Y, it's not necessarily on the same level of values that are there. And I think that one of the things that's a real challenge for those who are interacting on social media is that they don't sign up necessarily to the same values. They don't necessarily check their facts, and I think that's really critical. I started out my career as a fact checker, and I think it's really important. And to that extent, it allows one side to have an edge over the other without that necessarily signing up to what it really means. And I think that's really a problem with the speed that's out there, that there isn't this way of saying, but hey, that isn't really true. Hey, I didn't mean that.
The trailer, so to speak, that caused so much of an uproar across the region, around the Muslim world and the Arab world. Whether that's propaganda or not, I think what it does actually point to is the fact that anti-American sentiment in this part of the world has existed long before this trailer. I do wonder then, if large portions of the region view America, for better or worse, as an imperialist power. And the reason I bring this up is because it actually influences politics. Do they then equate, as some people do, the State Department's push of these technologies, Twitter, Facebook, and so on and so forth, as part of that imperialist approach? We know this is widely held belief in the Arab world, perhaps among certain people in Russia. What are your thoughts on how to counter that message, and is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I've been accused of creating a military-industrial complex with Silicon Valley more than once. I wish I had that much power. I don't.
But the perception exists.
No, the perception exists among some, but the very simple fact of the matter, I mean, the truth is actually the best response to this, which is that even the people who run these platforms have little to no control over what rides over it. Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg have little to no control over what campaigns take root in Facebook. You know, Jack Dorsey has no control over what people are tweeting. And so they are empty platforms. They take on the values and intentions of their users. So there are certain people, actually I think less from the Middle East than from China and certain other places, that view these American social media platforms as instruments of American interests. But the very simple facts countervail that. I mean, it's interesting to me that, you know, the biggest Facebook-based group in Egypt that helped propel that revolution, they used an American social media platform then when Secretary Clinton came to Cairo, they actually didn't want to meet with her. And when Facebook executives came to Cairo, I think they actually chose to not meet with them. So they didn't view Facebook in this case as the least bit American or conflate an American platform with American interests. They viewed it as something singularly their own. But these kinds of accusations will continue, and it's okay. If anything, it just encourages us to use non-American platforms. In Japan used Mixi, and Jordan used Maktub, and Russia used Vkontakte to sort of take the air out of that argument.
Ambassador, I'll ask you something that Alec referred to earlier, that it's a bad time to be a control freak. And yet, when it comes to diplomacy, and in foreign ministries, controlling your message is very important. Could you speak about the shift that's starting to happen, if there is a shift, as a result of, let's say, social media's disruptive nature on governance, but also on media?
Well, thank you. I think it's a very good point. Frankly speaking, picking up on the points that Debbie and Alec were making, I don't think propaganda in the traditional sense of the word stands a chance in the Twitter age. Government-produced propaganda, that's what I'm referring to. So the issue remains about the non-controlled propaganda that some individuals may wish to make for their own purposes, group purposes, individual purposes, which is a risk, obviously, because there is very little way to check and to control that kind of information which is diffused through Twitter. I would argue that it's also true for the internet in general. I remember at the very beginning of using internet, I wanted to find something about Shakespeare, and so I went on the web and I found this wonderful site which sounded right, sounded perfectly right, and then when I opened it, you just don't want to know what was in that site. So the issue of the control of the truthness and the correctness of the information is very much there, and it is linked obviously to the propaganda. Ministries need to be much quicker in responding. I think Alec is absolutely correct. I think we need to a certain extent, do away with the multiple layers of checks that we currently do when we issue a normal document, a normal press release. We need to be much, much quicker than that, and thereby the effect is that the responsibility of individuals increases. The margin of autonomy and degree of responsibility of individual increases. You need to take responsibility for what you put on the web, what you put on Twitter in such a quick span of time. Though I would also argue that sometimes the message being put on Twitter, my perception is that it is being perceived more as originated by the individual than by the official position of that individual, with exceptions, obviously. If the President of the United States tweets, obviously that is very obviously the tweet of the President of the United States. But for my own tweets, and after all, I am the ambassador of Italy to the United States, from the back and forth that I see, I don't necessarily see the answers that I get as involving me in my official capacity. So sometimes I do see some degree of separation between the Claudio Bisogniero and the Italian ambassador, which decreases maybe to a certain extent the notion of clearances, the notion of being quick and careful in what you put on the internet.
In the absence of journalists being on the ground in Syria or in Bahrain, where we've seen uprisings in the past year or so, David, I have to ask you, what role do you think social media plays in terms of how, let's say, elected officials of certain governments respond and react or engage with citizens of another country? Because we've seen the domino effect of these uprisings in the region and the instrumental role that these citizen journalists have played, even though you're right to caution that perhaps traditional journalists might use Twitter too much, and so it takes away time from original reporting. But what is the real role, for example, of social media activists in a place like Syria, where you just returned from?
Well, they can start fights. They can't finish. To be brutally frank, these tools empower people, give them hopes that they can accomplish change in the real world of power may not be feasible, and so they can provide the opportunity for really unfortunate results. I would just make a general comment about this issue of social media's utility for governments. It is just a fact that when new tools of any kind become available, militaries and security services examine their utility for achieving their purposes. And you can see examples of that in Russia, in China. I mean, the more you pull together a network, the more you've created the ways to suppress that network, manipulate it, feed it a false narrative. And I would suspect that there's quite a lot of effort that's given in the United States government, various parts of it, to understanding the social media landscape, yes, but to some extent shaping it, shaping perceptions. And I think that this is an area that people need to think about. At some point, my dream would be that people seeing the ways in which these open sources, open platforms are subject to manipulation would, of necessity, want trusted sources of information. Those used to be called newspapers.
Right.
And the reason that a newspaper was trusted is because the New York Times built up brand equity over 100 years of having thoughtful, objective people who would sift the world's news and decide what's true and what's not, what do you need to know, what don't you need to know. And I hope in this big pendulum, 5 or 10 years out, the need for trusted sources that do that vetting of information will be greater.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you. No, I think Alex has absolutely a point. It happened before, now it's happening in a different way, and it needs much more rapidity. It happened before. When I was at the UN 10, 15 years ago, the common understanding was that the 16th member of the UN Security Council was CNN. You all know that there are 15 members on the Security Council, but the impact of images on, say, Rwanda or things like that had such an impact that it forced decisions by the Security Council that otherwise would not have been taking place, or in any case not in that time frame. What is happening today is something not very different. What is different, I believe, is the scope, the numbers, and the rapidity, and that's why we need to be much, much quicker in our reactions.
Just want to add a brief, an obvious point that the ubiquity of cell phone cameras makes every person who has one, and that's virtually every young person in the world these days, a CNN reporter. There's this wonderful example of a woman who was being bullied in Saudi Arabia by the Mutaween, the religious police, because her fingernails had been painted too brightly, this religious policeman thought. And he tried to harass her and send her packing. And
The video in the mall.
Resisted and filmed the whole thing. And it went viral in Saudi Arabia, and it was an instrument of fighting back against people who have, for Saudi women, been an enormous problem. And it was just that, you can't do this to me without my being able to capture it and send it to people immediately. I mean, if you're in Aleppo and you're with fighters who are, racing in from, they want to show you their cell phone videos. They want to show you what they've lived and done. I mean, it's fascinating. Everybody's making or living in their own movie or newscast. But that's a very powerful aspect of this technology, the ability to capture reality and use it for accountability.
And the question for all of you is, given the constraints, the issues of accuracy, time constraints, people being overloaded with information, being spread too thin, how do you define effectiveness for your various Twitter, social media engagements in your environment?
So a broad question. Perhaps we'll start with you, Ambassador. How do you define effectiveness? Your social.
Well, I presume, like for any other government official or anybody who has a public responsibility, the ability to make sure that our message is understood. And this has nothing to do with propaganda, once again. That the message is understood and that the views that we express are recognized. I don't want to say necessarily shared, but at least recognized as valid news. That is the degree of effectiveness I'm looking for as I operate as a government official, as an ambassador here. We run quite a number of initiatives that go well beyond the political sphere. We run initiatives in the economic, in the cultural, and so many other areas. And I think it's important to be on the map, and I think we are on the map of the social media with those initiatives.
As you and I were speaking as we were walking up the hill here about the importance of listening and engaging, not just putting out information. So perhaps in the context of being effective through social media when it comes to e-diplomacy, how important is listening?
I think listening is one of the most important factors, because you already know, if you're putting out a message, you know what it is, and you know what you think the impact will be, but you don't necessarily know how the other person perceives you, how valuable the information that you have is for them, or not valuable at all. And I think that that's really critical for us at the UN when we're trying to deal with public information. Because a lot of the information that we're dealing with may not be very interesting to you. I mean, why would you want in this room to watch a video on electoral assistance? That's not very interesting. You can vote in your countries for the most of you. But in some countries, it's really what's critical. And I'd like to share an example of what I mean about what's important. There was a really telling moment back in January of 1991 in Lithuania, where there was a very difficult situation there with the Lithuanians trying to defend their call for independence. And it was very tense, it had been very violent. And I guess it was about the 14th or 15th of January, I was in where the leaders of Lithuania were, and then all of a sudden there was this laughter and happiness. And what it was a delegation of the former Polish opposition that showed up in Lithuania to share their experience with Lithuania. And it's this kind of anticipation, if you will, and information that can be shared in advance. I mean, anybody who had been following the Middle East and North Africa knew that these regimes would not last forever. But how much preventive information was put out there? How much anticipation was there of information that would be valuable to the citizens of these countries before something happened? And that's where I think the kind of listening that we could do would be very valuable in the kind of solutions that we might be able to propose.
Alex, same question, but I want to kind of frame it in the context of what's happened in Lebanon a few days ago. I follow the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Najib Mikiti, who, by the way, is very, very voluble on Twitter. And I just want to read a couple tweets that he tweeted since the incident of the bomb blast, the car bombing in Lebanon. He said, his most recent, "I pray and ask God to grant all of us in government and opposition the wisdom to act in the interest of Lebanon, away from sectarian emotions." There have been calls for his resignation. The president, Michel Sleiman, who also uses Twitter quite frequently, asked that he not resign. As you know, he then said, "My resignation is on hold for the sake of Lebanon's stability. Chaos is not an option for me. National unity is a must for Lebanon." He earlier, a few days ago, tweeted, "Just ending my meeting with Lakhdar Brahimi. He is truly the significant person for such a crucial mission. I wish him the best," in regards to his mediating the Syria crisis. A stat that was done by Burson Marsteller in the Twiplomacy study found that 1/5 of the Prime Minister's tweets are replies. And I know from having followed him that he spends at times an hour or 2 hours having an online public conversation as the Prime Minister of one of the most geopolitically relevant countries in the Middle East with citizens. So the question then, to piggyback off of your question, is there a risk there? And do you think that leaders and politicians are always aware of the risk in inciting further violence and division by being so public in their conversations? Or do you think it's always good? I mean, I'm all for transparency, but many people reacted to his tweets and referenced his tweets as implicating Syria, for example, as being behind the bombing. Your thoughts?
Yes, so let me speak to this sort of generally as opposed to as a specific response to what's taken place over the last couple of days in Lebanon, but it sort of illustrates the point. Every leader needs to calculate what the best use of their time is, what platforms to use to communicate publicly, how publicly or how privately to communicate, and then we all have to be very mindful about the words that we choose. This is social media makes this more immediate. What this does is it makes the calculations that leaders had to make 5 or 10 years ago about the degree to which they would be aggressive on media, the degree to which they would be seek out CNN or Al Jazeera or others as outlets. What they now have is they have more choices, and instead of having to line up a press conference or something like this, they can just reach in their pocket and send something. You need to have a lot of judgment that you bring to bear in your public communications. And again, without speaking specifically to what took place in Lebanon, this is a lot of what we focus on as diplomats. You can't become an American ambassador right now without getting trained by me.
Why is that?
Not about how to use Twitter or Facebook, but it's about the changing information environments in our countries. It's not always about social media. In Yemen, it's about radio. In other places, it tends to be a mixture of media. But it's very important for a leader to understand the information environment in which they are working and the level of sophistication you have to have as a leader to be able to advance your interests and do so in a way that doesn't compromise yourself. It's very, very difficult. The skill sets requisite to a leader, to a chief of mission or others, I think are only increasing as the world becomes more networked. And the easier choice is to simply say, I'm going to button up, I'm not going to be using these tools or other such things. But the risk in that is you face degraded influence. Your ability to actually persuade publics, your ability to actually connect and engage. If you isolate yourself, then your ability to advance your country's interests is diminished. So much more is being asked of our leaders, and I think that part of what we will see are leaders emerge who are particularly sophisticated about how to communicate publicly across all of these different platforms.
So very briefly, it's a balancing act, obviously, but many people criticize leaders who don't engage and only use it as a messaging or amplification system. Would you advocate for at least some engagement?
I mean, some engagement is better than no engagement, certainly, but just by way of full disclosure, I do not spend an hour or two, every day on these tools, and I'm supposed to be practicing digital diplomacy.
Right.
I think it's very important. You can be drowned both in the information that is transmitted over these networks as well as drowned by the interest that people have to communicate with you. I view this more as like having office hours. If you're a professor, you don't have 40 hours of office hours during the week. You might have an hour or two. So set aside an hour or two, but the benefit of it is that it's all done in public. So the communication is legitimately not one-to-one. It's more like having office hours with hundreds of thousands of people watching. So that's the approach that I take.